Hello, welcome! This is Oksana, the host of easyexposure, the tutorials about photography. In today's video, as I promised, we will be talking about HDR photography. If you would like to skip to a certain part of this video, please refer to the timeline posted in the description. Let's get started. So what is HDR? HDR stands for High Dynamic Range. And dynamic range is the difference between darkest dark and the lightest light in the image. HDR is meant to create images with more details and colors in both the darkest and the lightest parts of the image. Let's look at some images. For example, this one. As you can see, it's lit pretty evenly. We have great details in our lightest lights, which is the house. And also our blacks don't take a huge part of the image, it's just some shadows underneath the trees, and those don't bother me at all. When we look at our histogram, our information is spread through the middle, kind of evenly, with no high peaks on the left or high peaks on the right. That means that the camera handled dynamic range of this image pretty well, and it won't benefit from HDR processing that much. This image, on the other hand, has almost blown out sky and also a lot of dark parts which lost all the details. When we look at its histogram, we can see that there is almost no information in the middle, and there is a huge peak on the left, which represents darkest darks, and also peak on the right, which represents our highlights. It's not all the way to the right, but it's pretty close. So image like this could be a good candidate to try out HDR. Different cameras can have slightly different dynamic range. For example, my Nikon D610 can capture about 14 stops of light in one image. If you don't know what stops of light are, please watch my lesson 1, 2, 3, and 4. On the other hand, our human eyes can see up to 20 stops of light. That's why sometimes we can capture in the image all the details we saw in the real life with our own eyes. Nowadays, there are a lot of opinions about HDR photography. A lot of people think that it's too old-fashioned, too overused, over the top, too fake looking, but in my opinion, I think HDR photography can be useful in the right situation, and if it's not too overdone, I think you should give it a try. And at the end of the day, it's art. Whatever floats your boat. Not everybody has to like it. It's fun to experiment. And now we will talk about some situations in which you should try HDR photography and see which results you get. It is very common to use HDR for landscape photography. Very often you might end up in a situation where there is a huge contrast between the sky and the scenery itself. This is why when you expose for the scenery, your sky might look kind of white, blown out, lose details and colors. So this is when HDR photography can come to rescue and bring those details and colors back into the sky, as well as bring more details and colors to the whole image, if you choose to. But just try not to overdo it. This is another example of landscape photography. This time we have some clouds in the sky, which we can barely see. When I photographed this image, I could clearly see them with my eyes, but camera just didn't capture them because of the dynamic range limitation. HDR can actually bring those clouds out and even create this kind of surreal painterly look. HDR can also bring the details back to backlit subjects, like those palm trees in this image. At the moment they look just black, but when we shoot and process the images as HDR, we will be able to see more details in them. Here is a close-up comparison. Though, if you can, doesn't always mean that you should, since silhouettes do often look interesting as well. HDR can also be useful for night photography, especially if we have some bright neon signs or lit windows on the buildings, because those often get overexposed. So pay attention in this image to Bass Pro Shop cyan, how it will change. As you see, we got its colors back. One of the most common uses of HDR photography is real estate. Unless you're going for something artistic, in most real estate images you want to show as many details of your house as possible. But usually you can run into problems of uneven light. When you have windows, they often will be blown out like in this image, which doesn't really look that great. To solve the problem, you can use HDR. It can bring out the details in the window as well as even out the light in the whole room. The same is if you have some bright light sources in a room at night. When you use HDR, it can bring details back in the lamps, like in this photo. Look at the difference even on the wall.
So as you can see, HDR photography has its place to be. But did you know that it didn't start in the digital times? Ansel Adams is actually known as the first photographer who was using HDR, who was creating HDR images. He is known for his so-called zone system, and he was also using fast development method in a darkroom to create his HDR images, where highlights and shadows were properly exposed. Nowadays, we have it all much easier with digital cameras because we can do it all on computer without getting our hands dirty. Though I had experience of working in a dark room, and it is a lot of fun. HDR is often created by taking different exposures of the same scene and then combining them into one image in post-production. Though nowadays, some cameras have such a great dynamic range that you can pull a lot of information out of single raw file, and you might not even need multiple exposures. So it will depend on the camera you have as well as the scene you photograph. If you see that there is a lot of contrast in that scene, one image might not be enough, and it's always a good idea to take different exposures, just in case. Some cameras actually have HDR mode built into them and can process the images right in the camera without having to take them into computer. Let me show you how. To activate HDR mode in my camera, I will have to go to menu, shooting menu, and then scroll down. As you can see, HDR is not highlighted yet. That means that this mode is not active and cannot be used. And there is few reasons why. First of all, I will have to check if my auto exposure bracketing is on, because if it's on, this mode cannot be used. So I will find auto exposure bracketing button, and then we will check. And sure enough, it's set to 3 frames. That means it's active, so I will have to set it to 0. This way I turn auto exposure bracketing off, and then we will also have to check image quality, because if it's set to RAW, it means we cannot use this in-camera HDR mode with the RAW images, only with JPEGs. I'm not sure if it's only my camera or if there are some cameras already which can do it in RAW, but I think most cameras cannot, so we will change it to JPEG. So let's check now if it's active. Sure enough, HDR mode is active now and we can use it. So let's go into the settings, and we will have two options here. You can take single photo, and as soon as you do, your settings will go back to off and it will turn off the HDR mode. Or we can take series of pictures, and camera, if you set this setting, camera will keep on taking HDR images. But it's important to come back to this menu and turn it off when you're done, because in this mode you can't even set your image quality back to RAW. So let's choose single photo for now. You also have an option to choose the exposure difference between your frames, and it can be 1 stop, 2 stops, or 3 stops, and we will choose 2 stops. And also you can choose your smoothing to high, normal, and low, and you can actually experiment with these settings. So
As soon as you have it all set, you can take your image and you will have your HDR photo. And if you are not using slow shutter speeds, you can even hand hold the camera while doing that. And here's the example of the image without HDR, and this one was taken in camera HDR mode. As you can see, we have more details in dark parts of the image. You can try this method out if you don't want to do any processing of the images, but I think taking multiple exposures and work on them in different computer programs can give you better results. Before we start shooting multiple images and then combining them into HDR, I want to show you how to create HDR effect out of single image. We'll be working in Lightroom, which is fantastic software when you need to organize and edit your images. I use it all the time, and if you never tried it, I highly recommend you to. I will have a link in the description below to a free trial. And the image we will be working on, I took when I went to Hawaii. We were on Maui and we went on top of the volcano, and we were so high that the clouds were actually below us. And this white blob you can see are beautiful fluffy clouds I saw with my own eyes, but camera unfortunately wasn't able to capture it because I exposed for the landscape itself and they were just blown out. But I shot my images as I always do in RAW, and I hope there is still some hope for this image. So let's give it a try. Also, you can see on my histogram that I have this peak all the way to the right, and this represents my highlights. But luckily it's not all the way to the right, and there is still some space, so I hope I can still recover those highlights and bring some details in those clouds back. So let's get started. Let's go to develop module, to basics, and first of all we will push highlights to the left and see what happens. So watch, and ta-da! We actually got a lot of details out of those clouds. Also, what we can do, we can bring our exposure a little bit to the left. But that will darken your whole image as well as my landscape. So we don't want that because it's already pretty dark. But what we can do now, we can push those shadows a little bit to the right. And this will recover some details in the shadowy areas. But in general, it will decrease the contrast in the image. But we can always add it back. So let's add some of the contrast back, as well as clarity. To bring some more details in the image, we can add a little bit more clarity. Just don't go crazy on the clarity. Some people do this to get this HDR-ish effect, but I personally don't like it, but it's up to you. So I will add just a little bit of clarity. What else can we do? Also, what we could do with some images, it works better than others. We could go to the brush mode and just affect certain areas of the image. For example, we can darken those clouds by bringing the exposure to the left and just painting them with a brush. But I don't want to do this effect too much to this image because I don't want our clouds to be gray. I still want them to be white and fluffy. But I just wanted to show you that you can do this as well, just affecting the certain areas of the image. What else? I almost never touch saturation because usually it just affects the whole image and makes it crazy looking. Sometimes I use vibrance, but most of all what I like to do if I want to play with saturation is to saturate certain colors in the image. Like for example here, it might be nice to bring out some of those colors in plants. So we can pop our green, we can add some more green saturation, we can add some yellow and maybe some orange. I think it looks already pretty nice. We achieved our goal, we recovered the details in the clouds, and let's check out before and after. As you can see, it's a huge difference. The image looks much nicer now. If you don't have Lightroom, but you have Photoshop, you can do the same manipulations in Adobe Camera Raw. Single image might not work for every scene, and in this case you will need multiple exposures, and this is how I usually photograph them. First of all, I would recommend to use a tripod and even remote control. To merge images together, there should be preferably no movement in the camera or movement in the scene. Even though HDR software can perform image alignment, too much movement can cause some issues. So by using tripod and remote, you can eliminate those issues altogether. Also, often you might be using long exposures at slow shutter speeds, and I hope you already know you should shoot those using the tripod. I would also recommend you to use manual focus because you don't want your focus to change from frame to frame even by accident. So the way how I usually do it, I pre-focus on automatic and then I change my focus to manual so it doesn't change anymore, and then I take pictures. Another question is, how many images shall you take? Well, it's always better to take more and then just delete the ones you don't need than to have less. It will depend on your camera, it depends on the scene, and when you shoot more and gain more experience, you will know better. So just experiment. In my previous video, I showed you a few different ways how you can do exposure bracketing, but my favorite way is to use both auto exposure bracketing as well as exposure compensation. My favorite method is to use auto exposure bracketing, and you will have to locate it in your camera. In my camera, it's right here. When I press it, I can set how many frames I want to shoot. Unfortunately, my camera can only go to up to 3 frames, and I can also change how many stops of light is difference between my frames. I can go all the way to 3 stops of light, but I can show you a workaround. If, for example, I want to shoot more than 3 frames, I can shoot 3 images with those settings, and if I want to shoot them real fast, I can also set my camera into burst mode, so I can just hold my button and it will take images real fast. And then I will change my exposure compensation, and exposure compensation is right here with plus and minus. I can change it to -3, take 3 more images, then I change it to +3, and then take 3 more images again. This way I will have 9 images total. You might not need it, but you know that you have this option if your camera has the same limitations as mine. Also, please keep in mind that you want to be in aperture priority mode to use this method, because you cannot change exposure compensation in manual mode. And also you want to be changing your shutter speed, because if you would change your aperture to change your exposure, you will also be changing your depth of field, and you don't want that. And also if you change your ISO to change your exposure, you will have different amount of noise in your different frames, and this is also not good for HDR. So keep it in aperture priority mode. Usually on a tripod, it's more convenient to change all those settings from the back screen. Just press Info button to activate it. Now I will show you how to combine those images in post-production. We will be using Lightroom again, which is very easy to do, and I have this image which I showed you before where we have this very dark room, but at the same time our window is totally overexposed. But luckily I took 9 different exposures of this image, and let's see what happens if we combine them all into HDR. So to do so, first of all, we have to select all the images. We will click on the first one and then hold Shift and click on the last one. And as you can see, I have 9 frames from the lightest to the darkest. And in the darkest frame, our window is visible, unlike on other frames. So we have some details in the window. Then we will have to right click on one of the images and then go to Photo Merge and then HDR. And then this HDR window will pop up. We will have few options. Auto align option is for you if you was holding the camera and your frames are not perfectly the same, it will help you to align them. But as I said before, it's better to have your camera on a tripod. Then auto settings, Lightroom will adjust some settings for you in develop module, and I will show you later. Then we have the ghost. This is when if you have something moving in the frame, it will help you to take care of it. But we don't have anything moving in our image, so we just keep it at none. And as you can see, we got some preview of the image we got. Our rooms became much brighter and our window has more details in it. And then we can just click merge. And then Lightroom is creating new image. Sometimes it can take a little bit longer if you have more images to combine together. Ta-da! We got our combined image right here. So we can open this a little bit. And we can go to develop module. And as you can see, Lightroom already did some adjustments for us. So you can see that Lightroom did some adjustments in highlights area, in shadows, even add some saturation and vibrance. If we want, we can play with it a little bit more. But I think we got pretty good result and you got an idea. I wanted to also do a little experiment. What if, for example, I will use only 3 frames, 3 exposures instead of the whole 9? Let's see what we get. So I want to make sure that I will have exposure which has window properly exposed, then maybe something in the middle, and then some light exposure. So I have 3 exposures. There is whole 3 stops difference between them because I wanted to make sure that I get one exposure which has window properly exposed. So let's try to merge them. Well, the result is not so bad. The window is not as perfect as on another picture, but let's compare them. Let's click merge. Need to wait a little bit. Okay, here it is. It's loading, come on. Now we will look at it in develop module. I think we can bring exposure, total exposure a little bit down. And let's compare it to the image we had before. So this one on the left, it was 9 exposures, and this one on the right was only 3 exposures. But as you can see, they are very, very similar. Maybe when you look at it with magnification, you will see more difference. But as you saw, I took 3 frames and there was 3 stops exposure difference between them. And we got very similar results. But still, I would recommend you to shoot more because just to make sure that you have all the details you need on a darker exposure and all the details you need on a lighter exposure. Of course, you can do this in Photoshop as well, and you can get there even through Lightroom, just right-clicking and then add it in, merge to HDR Pro in Photoshop, or through Camera Raw as well. But I'm not going to show you this in this video.
In my next videos, I will show you a few more programs you can use to create HDR images. But till then, go and try to shoot some. And I would love to see your results either on my Facebook group, which is Easy Exposure Facebook group, or in my photography forum at easy-exposure.com. And also, I really appreciate that you stayed till the end of this video. I hope you liked it. I would like to hear your feedback, so please comment below, share with your friends, subscribe to this channel if you're new. I really, really appreciate you, and I'm very happy that I am back again to making videos for you. You can also follow
follow me on other social media. It's either Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. I would be really happy if you do, and I see you next time. Have a wonderful day. Bye bye.